All right, so let's review what we know so far about PHP pages. One is that they are executed on the server side. And PHP pages are a mix of HTML code and CSS code, CSS and PHP code. And the HTML code is sent to the browser as is. There's no translation or processing done to the HTML code. The PHP code, however, is executed by the server, and the output from that is sent to the user. So we had the example last time where we had a loop that squares from 1 to 100, or from whatever number we entered to whatever other number we entered. So it's a mix of those two things. And implied in this is that your code is processed by a server, which means that I simply can't go and click on this page and open it, the browser.
You turn on the projector.
Yeah. A couple close calls with almost making my password visible on the screen. So that's why I like, because when I log into WebEx, when I log into Canvas, as we would use ID and password, okay, fine. But when I log into WebEx, I have to put in my email address twice, and then I put my password in. So I'm always starting to put my password in the second time it asks for the email, and it's almost exposed it. So a lot of times that's happened in an empty room, fortunately. But anyhow, that's why I sometimes forget to turn on the projector. I know that's not your problem, but all right. What I was saying is a PHP page has to be processed by a web server. I can't simply open it up in a browser. Therefore, I can't do something like this and open up this PHP page in Firefox or Chrome or whatever. Now, in this case, because this page is mostly HTML, it sort of worked. But when we see other pages, or when we see this one, when it's completely done, you'll see how it needs to be processed. Let's look at this one instead. I'm getting all the ones that don't look bad when I open them up. What am I doing wrong? Let's open up this one. There we go. We don't get the results that we are looking for. Right? This is supposed to be a chart to show the heart rate. So the bottom line is these have to be processed through a web server that knows PHP, that has PHP installed. And if you install the XAMPP, that's one way to get that. And I would hope by now that everyone has installed and tested out and make sure that XAMPP works on their machine. I'm going to take these and I'm going to put them in the web server's root pay location, which is different for me than it probably will be for you, because this is running Microsoft's IIS as opposed to XAMPP. So for me, it's CINET pub www root. So I'm going to get rid of what's there. And I'm going to put in there these files. Let's take a second to overview what this little web app does. So I have, my homepage is called index.php, and web servers are typically configured to look for files named index.html, index.php, index.aspx, or whatever. So I'm going to go in and just type in the name of the server, which is localhost, and it should bring up my web server because it should bring up my homepage because the web server is configured to bring up that page if no URL is, if not a complete URL is given. So I just type in localhost and there I get. Notice how that's different than when I just opened it up in the browser. I didn't see all this stuff. All right, what this is meant to be is this is meant to be a web page that has for fitness, and it has two main dynamic PHP parts. One of them is a heart rate chart. So for example, depending on your age rate, from 20 to 80 here, this is the range that your heart rate should be in when you're exercising. So a 20-year-old exercising, your heart rate should be within 100 beats per minute and 160. Now, again, don't use this for medical advice. All right, this is just stuff I got off the internet. See your doctor if you have any questions about the appropriateness for you exercising. This is just using the standard equations, and again, your mileage may vary, but for illustrative purposes, the highest your heart rate should be is 200 beats per minute. As you go older, that drops a little bit. At 65, your heart rate should be between 77.5 and 124 beats per minute, and the absolute maximum it should be is 155. So that's one part of this. Another part of this is a calculator where I put in my age and I put in how many beats my heart has in 6 seconds. So let's say it has 12 beats in 6 seconds. And this will tell me if I'm in the optimal heart range or not. It doesn't actually show the range or anything. It just gives me a message saying you're in the optimal heart range or you are not in the optimal heart range. If I put something like 45 and I said my heart was beating 35 beats per minute. Oh, in 10 seconds, that would be ridiculous. 20 beats in 6 seconds. And it tells me I'm above the optimal exercise heart range. So there are 3 main lessons I want to teach with this example. And we'll go off and maybe hit some other side quests throughout the process. But there's 3 main lessons I want to learn. The first one we're going to look at are what are called include files. Notice that all these pages have the same layout, have the same appearance. You have a header, you have a navigation, you have the body of the page, and then you have a footer. And in fact, when we go and do the calculation, the results page has the same layout. This is accomplished through what are called include files. So that's the first thing that we're going to look at here. The other thing we're going to look at is how to break down your code into functions so that your code is reusable. In this case, obviously, there should be some common code, right? Because the rules for calculating this range ought to be the same rules when I do this calculator, right? I shouldn't be able to get different results here than I get here. All right. And that's done by using the same code, right? You're not going to have 2 separate calculations that do the same thing. I think I talked about DRY, dry, in this course. Do not repeat yourself. Well, you wouldn't want to repeat yourself and have duplicated code to calculate the heart range, the range of heartbeats per minute 2 different ways. So even though these output different stuff, the core calculation is going to be shared in one function. So we're going to look in detail about breaking down our code into multiple functions that can be reusable. And we'll look at what are the characteristics of writing code that lends itself to having reusable functions. In there, we're going to get into a little bit of validation, client-side validation and server-side validation. Well, I should have validated for a negative heart rate, huh? Okay, first things first, include files. For clarity, I've called these include files, I've given them an INC file extension. That actually, you actually should not use the INC file extension. That is less secure than if you use the .php file extension. So all these with an INC should have a PHP extension. I wanted to make it obvious that these are include files, they're not complete pages. So in my example, the PHP pages are complete pages. The INC files are include files. Now, what is in an include file? And the answer to that is anything that you can put on a PHP page, you can put in an include file. So you can put HTML code. You can put HTML and CSS. You can put HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. You can put anything that you could put on a PHP page in an include file, including PHP code. What are the advantages of putting things in include files? The advantage is the same advantage that you have when you put your CSS code in a separate external file, right? Why do we do that? Why do we put our CSS code in an external file? We do that so that we can share that between pages, all right? So all our pages can have the same look and have the same layout. We do that by keeping our pages having the same structure and putting the CSS in a separate file. That way, if we want to change something, we only need to change it in one place, and every place will get will show that change. Same idea here. Now, if we look at this index page, we're going to look at the home page for a second. There it is. We'll notice that this is, as I said before, a mix of plain old HTML code and PHP code. Now, in our example, the PHP code are include statements. So what do these include statements do? These include statements take the contents of this file and more or less paste it right here in this position. So when the server processes a PHP page that has include files, it takes and it adds the code that is in the include file right here in the page. So for example, notice what I have. I have an include file for the header, an include file for the nav, and I have an include file for the footer. All right. Those are 3 sections of the page that I want to be identical on all my pages in my site. I want the header to be the same, I want the navigation to be the same, and I want the footer to be the same. So rather than duplicating that code and repeating myself and having all that HTML here, all that HTML here, I've gone and I've put that code in an include file and then use the include statement in PHP, and that brings in the code at this position. So let's look at include the header inc. You had a question?
Yeah, I was ahead of this, and I don't have the parentheses, but it still works. Do we?
I don't think so. I think you can do this as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Doesn't really matter. I usually do that just for clarity. You know, typically function calls have parentheses for the argument, so I go and keep that convention. All right, let's look at the header include file. The header include file contains everything in the header section of the page. The header, H1 that appears in the header, and the paragraph that appears there underneath that. Now, if I were to choose to change this header to add something in here, maybe an image of my Fitness Places logo, or we'll just add another paragraph. I might make that change here, save it. And refresh, and that will appear on the page. And it will appear on every page, since every page has that include file in it. If I were to look at each one of these pages, see that they all include the header and nav and the footer. That's why if I have a site that I'm doing, let's say, and it's basically static HTML, I will use PHP anyhow, just so I can take advantage of the include files. So I can have my common sections in a common place, so that if I change them, it makes the change throughout the entire website. And if we look at the other include files, they're fairly self-explanatory. Here's our nav. And here's our footer. So you want to get used to doing that in PHP. All right. So if you were sketching out what your site looks like, and you're creating a wireframe, I hope those of you that have taken CISS232 remember the wireframe. And I were to sketch out my wireframe, and I were going to say I want it to look like this. header, nav, main section, footer, say FAQ here. If I were to do that, I would identify what part of this wireframe is going to be common on every page. What part do I want to look the same? And let's say it's this, and this. Well, then I would have 4 includes because I want it common on every page. I want to put that code in one place so that it can be reused on each page and I'm not repeating myself. Pretty straightforward, and again, but take advantage of it. You have an assignment. I'm not sure when the assignment is due. Maybe next week. That you're required to use include files for. Let me see. 8. Oh, I haven't assigned it yet. It'll be lab 9. We're going to do something similar to this, and you should be using include files. Keep in mind when you start that assignment that you need to include files and do them similarly to how I've done them in this case. All right, so that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today. The other thing I want to start talking about is the functions that we have and what makes for a good function. We're going to do that. We're going to start that off by looking at the chart. The chart is similar to what we did with the square example, except instead of showing the square, I'm showing the heart rate range and the maximum heartbeat. So let's see how I accomplish that. So let's look at the chart code. Again, I have my header, nav, and footer down here. But I have another include file. The include file of heart include. This contains all the functions that I'm going to use for the calculation of the heart rate, the range, maximum heart rate, and so on. So all the functions to do this calculation are going to be put in this include file. So it's a pretty important one, so I'm going to open it now. As I mentioned before, an include file can contain anything that's in a PHP page. This one simply contains a list of PHP functions. So this is sort of the brains, the real functionality of this. And sure enough, when we look at the other example, when we have the calculator, that calculator is going to contain the same include file because we want to use the same functions for calculating in that case that we use when we display the chart. So let's see what we have here. A for loop starts age at 20, does it as long as age is less than or equal to 80, and it increments age by 5 each time through the loop. So that's why we get 20, 25, 30, all the way through 80. I'm creating my table, and notice how I'm popping in and out of PHP. Notice, for example, that this is in PHP and the ending brace for the for loop is in PHP. That's why it's critical to align things properly so that you can tell at a glance what belongs with what. Because if you have a very complicated page and you have if statements and for loops and all that, you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to figure out what belongs with what, especially if you get an error saying that that you're missing a bracket or a brace or whatever. So I have it in this case where this lines up with this. That's also another reason for using functions, because if I put this code here, that would really expand this TD out. And there'd be a lot more instructions here, and I'd really have a hard time telling what's inside the loop and what isn't. But in the main page, my code is very concise. All the work that's being done is being done by calling a function. So I create my table tag for this. I give the top row with a heading for age, range, and max. Each time through the loop, I'm creating a new row, right? Because between that and that is this block of HTML, which creates a new row. That row consists of 3 TDs. First TD, second TD, third TD. In the first table data cell, all I'm doing is printing the age. So I'm just printing the value of the loop counter. So that's going to print 20, 25, 30, all the way through 80. Notice the syntax, very concise. We pop into PHP mode. We do our print. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. We do our print, and then we're out of PHP mode. So the code is very concise. We could do this on multiple line, but I think in that case, the multiple line makes it a little more confusing. Now, the last 2 cells are a little more interesting. We have a function to calculate the minimum exercise rate and the maximum exercise rate. What are those a function of? They're a function of age. All right. In other words, your age determines the range for your exercise heart rate and the maximum heart rate. Therefore, we give that to the function. That's an argument that we pass to the function. When you're defining a function, you need to know what the inputs are and you need to know what the output is. A function can take multiple inputs, but it can only return one thing. And in our case, the thing that we're returning is an integer, is a number. All right? It might not be an integer, but it's a number. And we need to give it the age to do the calculation. So therefore, my function calls this calculate min x rate and gives it the age. Calculate maximum exercise rate and give it the age. I then concatenate those together to make this table cell that says the range is this through that beats per minute. Now here's a question you might ask yourself. Why doesn't the function, why don't I just have a function that I give it the age and it gives me a string that contains the range? I could do that. But what makes a function most reusable is if it returns something simple and it only does one thing. So for example, my hypothetical function, if I gave it an age and it printed out that string, it would have to calculate the minimum, calculate the maximum, and then concatenate it to make the result string. That's actually kind of three things. So much simpler if we break it down and say, hey, all this function is going to do is calculate the minimum range. All this function is going to do is calculate the maximum range. Once I have those, I can format the output however I want to. In this case, I format it by concatenating the two and putting beats per minute after it. Finally, I have a TD where I calculate the maximum rate given the age. Again, keep in mind these are different functions. These are like the range, the max X rate are like the most that you should go in exercise. The maximum rate is sort of like the danger zone. Don't go over this number of beats per minute. All right, if you do, then there's kind of a problem. Now, you don't see any of those functions in here. Why not? Because they're all in the heart include. So I want these functions to be good and reusable. What makes a function good and reusable? Let's look at some of these. Number one, function is reusable if you can, or a function is good if it can be put in a single screen. You can see the entire function from start to end in a single screen. And these you can see in a single screen, even though I have the zoomed in a little bit. This is probably bigger than you'd have zoomed in, but these functions fit. And why do I say that? Well, it's just nice to be able to view the entire function from beginning to end without having to scroll. Because if you have to scroll, like this function, I have to do a little bit of scrolling on, right? If this was at unzoomed, it probably would all fit on one page. But in a case like this, well, if I'm down here looking at this, I might forget, well, where does min come from, and have to scroll back up, So again, I would suggest that you try to keep it to one page. That's not like a cut and dried rule. There's going to be cases maybe where you have longer functions. But if your function is longer, you might want to consider breaking it down into separate functions. Second characteristic about a good function is it takes in all the inputs that it needs as arguments. So what do you need to calculate the maximum exercise heart rate, or the minimum exercise heart rate, or the maximum heart rate? All you need is the age. So notice that we're not referring here to any text boxes that are on the screen, or anything from the query screen, or anything like that. That would sort of couple this function very tightly with the pages it was used on. This function is sort of independent of whatever page we use it on. As long as you can supply it the age, whether you get it from a text box, whether you get it from a loop, whether you get it from a random number generator, it doesn't matter. As long as you give it the age, it can do the calculation and display the results. The second thing is we're not outputting this. We're not doing a print to output this. All right. That's a temptation a lot of students have. Well, I want it outputted. Well, you want it outputted in this case, but there might be other cases where you don't want it to be outputted. So therefore, you return the value and let whoever called it do what they want to with the results. So for example, in this case, I call the minimum exercise rate, the maximum exercise rate. They each return an answer, and I concatenate those together to form a little phrase, minimum dash maximum beats per minute. I might show that a different way. Here I'm putting it in a table cell. I might put it in a paragraph or in some other kind of tag. In this case, the functions are very straightforward. To calculate the minimum exercise rate, you first calculate the maximum exercise rate, which is simply 220 minus the age. And then you take half of that. By the way, is our calculation correct? We should look and verify that it indeed does that the way we thought it should. Notice we don't have that maximum heart rate calculation duplicated here. Why not? Because we have a function to do it. This function is going to do one thing, and if it needs to do something else, it will call a function to do it. So we're calculating the minimum exercise rate. In order to do that, we have to calculate the absolute maximum heart rate, and therefore we have a function for that as well. And we call that function to get the maximum, and then we take 50% of it or half of it to get the minimum exercise heart rate. Same thing with this, except the maximum is 80% of the maximum heart rate. So it first calls that, gets it. We don't have this code. We don't have this statement. Here. Because what if the medical field comes up with a new way of assessing your maximum heart rate, right? If it's in two places, we have to change it in two places. If we have a function that is going to be used everywhere on our site where that calculation is needed, we only have to change it in that one place. And we're going to call the function everywhere where we need that maximum heart rate. This isn't that much different than what we did with the square example, except instead of simply squaring a number, we're calling a function to get the result. And these functions are good because they're short, they only do one thing, and they use other functions as needed as opposed to duplicating the code to produce the intermediary result. One guide to tell if a function is good is to look at the name of it. And if the name has an and in it, then it's probably not a good function. You might consider rewriting it. Why do I say that? Well, here, calculate maximum exercise rate. One thing. What's this function do? It's calculating the maximum exercise heart rate. This one's calculating the minimum exercise rate. If the name of this function was calculate the maximum heart rate and calculate the minimum heart rate, then that's a sign that, well, that function is trying to do two different things, and it's probably not a good function. So these are short, they're self-contained. Any data that's needed gets passed in as an argument. Any output is given through a return value. We're not pulling the input from someplace on the screen. We're not putting the output someplace on the HTML document. We're simply taking the inputs, doing the calculation, and returning the output. Now, we'll see how far we can get on the calculation. Our calculator page has an action of check range. We'll ignore the validation for now. Better open up check range. Actually, I'm gonna reverse my path real quick here. We'll get into the PHP aspects of the calculator next time. Review the code and sort of get a head start on it. But we will discuss it next time. Let's look at the validate form function on this, which is in JavaScript. All right. We talked about validating data before. And it's very likely that you would validate data both on the client side and the server side. Why is that? Well, client side gives the user immediate feedback. You typed in something invalid here. Tells you that you're missing age. Now, that gives the user immediate feedback. Plus, it doesn't bother the server with a request that the server can't possibly process correctly. Can't calculate if you're in the appropriate heart range if you don't give me your age. All right. So you're saving the server doing extra work. Now, keep in mind, in this case, this is just an example, right? We could easily do this, all these calculations in JavaScript, but we're pretending that the calculations we're doing on the server need to be done on the server. All right. So keep that in mind as we go through this example. So our client-side server validation, we have on the form tag an onSubmit method that says return validate form. What does that mean? Well, validate form is going to return this flag be valid. And that is either going to be true or false. Be valid is a Boolean. We initialize it to true. There's something wrong with the age. We return a false. So this function returns a true or false. We are then returning to the event a true or false. Now, what does that mean? We return the result of this function, and that's either going to be a true or false. If the onSubmit method gets a true, it goes and it continues submitting the data to the server. If this onSubmit method gets returned a false, then that cancels the form being submitted. So like notice in this case, I don't type in age. Boom. We don't go to the server. That submission was canceled. Yet if I do put in the data, I'd submit the form to the next page. So that's what this means, to return validate form. Return the output of this function to the onSubmit event. If the onSubmit event gets a true, then it will continue and submit the form. If it gets a false, it will cancel submission. Now, in this case, I have a very simple example where all I'm testing is the age. I'm doing that because I'm going to want to do some server-side validation as well. Yes?
So is this pinging the server when validate?
No. This has not, until this function returns a true, it's not going to hit the server. So the validation, no validation happens on the server. This is only, and maybe I should have been more clear, this is JavaScript.
Yeah, I missed that.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't very clear about that. Good observation. This is server client-side JavaScript, by the way, that's doing this validation. And again, I'm going to demonstrate next time some server-side validation. And because of that, I just kept the validation on the client side very simple. All I'm validating is the age. All right, next time we'll look at the calculator in more detail, and we'll see how the calculator, even though it produces different output, uses the same functions. So when we click calculate and it comes up with this message, we're going to use some of the same functions that we used when we developed the chart, which is the way it should be, right? You shouldn't get different results if you run the calculator versus running the chart. So therefore, the best way to ensure that happens is by not repeating yourself and by having the code only in one place and using the functions in both places. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves, or I'm getting ahead of myself, because your lab isn't due for this for a couple weeks. That'll be posted in the next unit that I post. But you'll need to do something similar to this with tuition. You'll need to have a calculator and you'll need to have a chart, and it should be using the same functions to do both. All right, both the calculation of the tuition and the calculation from a calculator. Any questions? All right, that's all I had today. We will either see you in lab or see you next week.